Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation. I'm Jayaraj Sundaresan. Today, we are joined by Tomasz Michaldo from Auschwitz, Poland, which is the original name for the town that came to be called as Auschwitz. Thomas, thanks so much for joining us. We will have a conversation for about maybe 15 to 20 minutes, and Thomas will be present to answer any questions from the audience for a bit. So, Tomasz is head of Department Methodology of Guiding of the Memorial and Museum at Auschwitz-Birkenau, where he is responsible for the development and coordination of guided tours since 2013, and currently works on the creation of virtual tours. He is a graduate of history with specialization in Jewish studies and postgraduate in museum studies at the Jagiellonian University of Krakow. So, Thomas, thank you. So I thought we could start with some few questions. I have, as I mentioned earlier, to start some questions, and then we can take it from there. Is that okay?
That's okay.
Great. So can you tell us briefly about Auschwitz-Birkenau and what is the significance of Auschwitz-Birkenau in the modern human history?
Well, first of all, thank you for invitation, and it's really my honor to be able to participate in this conversation. Well, obviously, the significance of Auschwitz is that probably it is one of the best known place of the genocide in the world, and there are also of course several reasons for that. The first and the main reason I think is that there was quite a big number of survivors of the place, comparing to other places of the Holocaust, of the mass extermination of the European Jewry. In case of Auschwitz, it was really a great number of survivors because of the simple fact that Auschwitz was on one hand a death camp, so the place of the mass and immediate extermination of the Jews, but on the other hand, it was also a concentration camp where people were put for work. And because of that simple fact, we really had thousands of survivors of the place who could give their testimonies. Of course, not all of them were willing to do that, because sometimes the traumas that they experienced in the camp were so heavy and difficult that they were unable to talk about their experience for years after the liberation, and some of them are still struggling to do so. But still, we have many survivors who agreed to share their stories, and I think this is a crucial thing. On one hand, we have those testimonies. On the other hand, the history of Auschwitz is still quite well documented by the perpetrators, by the Nazis, by the clerks who worked in the camp. So we know we have two main sources that make Auschwitz that important. And with the years, it of course became the symbol of the Holocaust, and in general, from very universal point of view, also of the genocide as such. This is also because the voice of the survivors was quite well heard, and again, because we have those documents that we can just confirm the testimonies of the survivors in the documents we have right now. So anybody who tries to deny the oral history, the message of the survivors, can be of course confronted with the documents by the perpetrators, which in most of the cases just show very clearly what happened in the camp. And of course, there are also other dimensions that make Auschwitz that important. Of course, this is also the scale of the crime that was committed and perpetrated in the camp. Historians say that at least 1 million of Jews perished in the camp. So definitely for Jews across the world, it is it is very, or if not the most important place of the Holocaust. But I also want to stress that it is a very important place for non-Jews. As for example, for non-Jewish Poles. It was a concentration camp. Of course, Poles were not the subjects of some of the processes that happened in the camp. But it is also very important that over 70,000 of non-Jewish Poles perished in the camp. Sometimes with no certain reason. Sometimes these people were simply caught on the streets and deported to camps as a manpower, or just because SS men, or I mean the Nazis wanted to keep people in the occupied Poland frightened. And the good way of doing so was, of course, to just to make random roundups around different towns in Poland. So it is also a symbol for Poles. But I also do want to stress that this is also a very important place for the Sintian drama, for the Gypsies, as there are different statistics that say that around 500,000 of the Sintian drama of Gypsies perished during the Second World War. Some around 23,000 in Auschwitz. But again, in case of Auschwitz, it is very well documented also in their case. So we know that they spent certain time in the camp. We know when the decision to exterminate them was made, and it became also the central point in collective memory of the Sintian drama across Europe. So by that, I'm just trying to show that Auschwitz, the importance of Auschwitz is multidimensional. It's not just the Jews, it's not just the Holocaust, but it's also important for other groups of people, for people from different places, of different nationalities. So as far as we know, at least 1.1 million people perished in Auschwitz. That include, as I mentioned before, around 1 million Jews and some around 100,000 of non-Jews. And with the years, it just become, because it was the biggest camp, because as I mentioned, there were that many survivors, it just become, I think, the very universal symbol of the genocide and also the Holocaust.
Great. Yeah. I mean, if I may take from what you mentioned now, like maybe a follow-up question on that. A few years ago, there was a 70-year anniversary of, and a lot of survivors gathered there and so on. This idea that you said that the trauma because of which a lot of survivors could not talk, and in fact, you see now a lot of survivors are talking now about it. In the last few years, and many of them are 90s, and they're only able to talk now, really, right? And can you tell us a little bit more about that, please, if it's
Yes, it's a very significant that survivors, those who were silent for that many years, decide to share their story right now. I think they are aware of the fact that this is the really last moment, also for not only for us, not only for the people who did not experience it, but also for them to share their story somehow. And from my personal experience, I know that they really struggle when it comes to coming to Auschwitz, to Birkenau. That it's not an easy decision for them, because, for example, for years they tried to, in a way, just to forget about this, to create a new life, to come back to their lives in a way. They had families, and they just tried not to affect their children with their experience. But on the other hand, I think, and this is what most of the second generation, people from the second generation after the Holocaust, so children of the survivors, say that being silent I mean, the fact that their parents were silent also caused the traumas, because they wanted to know. They thought it's really, I mean, the second generation wants to know. But even if their parents are not talking, they are still affected. And even in their everyday life, they behave as if they had never left, I mean, mentally, the camp. And we know, for example, this is what the second generation says very, very often, that they had that tendency, to save food, or to ask people to eat everything they have on a plate. There are very simple things, but they just show us that, what happened 75 years ago didn't stop in 1945 with the liberation, but it somehow affects their lives also today.
Correct.
So I think if they decide to talk about this experience right now, it's very important for us. We have to listen to them. As in case of other genocides, it's also quite significant that in case of other genocides, not all the people were, of course, able to talk straight after it. They needed to process it somehow, and it's fully understandable, of course.
Yeah. I mean, it's very important that you said in that sense that, a large amount of, from my own research about it, a large amount of testimonies are more recent than earlier in this. And interestingly, it is actually in the case of the Holocaust that you actually hear more testimonies than other genocides. And it's also, one can say and think maybe that there is more support available, emotional supports, and there is a large conversations in this case for people to be able to talk about it and move on beyond the silence, compared to many other genocides, isn't it? It's a very significant point that one has to really be able to talk so that we know what actually happened in the world and keeps on happening in the world, isn't it?
It is definitely. Now, what we usually say here also to our visitors, who, many of them use the term never again, right? Auschwitz, never again. But the sad thing is that, of course, different scales, different places, different ways of perpetrating, but still similar things, genocides happened and are still happening in the world. Right. So if one thinks that we've learned something from Auschwitz, then my conclusion is that we as the humanity didn't really learn from that. And this is really a sad thing, because Auschwitz is not 100 or 200 years ago. It's just 2 generations behind us. It's less than 100 years. And I think this is really striking, that having that experience, both in Europe and in other places, of course, we still, some similar things are still happening.
Exactly. And one more question, just as a follow-up on that, is if you could tell a little bit more about the role propaganda and dehumanization broadly made or enabled something like this to be actually rolled out at such a large scale, in that point in time in history, in Germany and in Europe broadly.
I believe without the propaganda, this genocide wouldn't be that big. I mean, these were years of making people believe that there are some superior and inferior races.
Right.
And if, one of the survivors said once that Auschwitz did not descend from the skies, meaning that the gas chambers of Auschwitz are not the beginning of the genocide. It started earlier. It started already in 1930s. Correct. With the propaganda, with the words, with the hatred towards those who are considered to be others, less important. And it really started with words. And this is what we also say, propaganda. And, between 1933 and 1940, so in the years before Auschwitz was established and when the Nazis were already in power in Germany, people across the country were really, I don't want to use the term brainwashed, because it means that somebody who is brainwashed is rather not responsible for his or her deeds, but they were. But still, I think most of the perpetrators were really convinced that what they are doing is right. And this is, of course, the because of the propaganda. And also, if we take a look on Auschwitz or on other camps, the inmates in the camp had no names, no surnames. They were just the numbers.
Yeah.
Which in a way also helps the perpetrator to look on them as on those who are less worthy than the others, who you can write down the number and then decide just to erase it because it's just a number, it's not the person. And I think definitely you touched upon very important issue, that the propaganda that leads to genocide. So we can see it also on the example of other genocides, like for example in Rwanda, also very similar. Before the genocide, there was that period of the propaganda in radio, in newspapers, and so on.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, the use of the terms is a very significant thing, which I've been noticing in this, like, the notion of transport, the idea of liquidation, the words that are used, like in Rwanda, as you said, they use the word cockroach, for instance. I mean, this kind of dehumanization is enabled through this, propaganda and taking human away from it and making them as a number, as a thing, as a material, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, great. So yeah, very. Working on this is extremely traumatic. In fact, we had a conversation, remember, about your occupational traumas of it. But anyway, so moving on. So the next one of the questions: what is the significance of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum and Memorial?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? This is a unique situation because, it's a museum and a memorial in a site of the genocide. It is in a cemetery, but it is not, isn't it? In a sense, it is all put together as a renovated place. Yeah.
Exactly. You pointed out a very important thing, that it cannot be perceived as the museum, right? This is the museum that is located in the memorial space, in the authentic space, which is also very, very important for us. And I think the significance is really huge. First of all, because we have, or we used to have before the pandemic, of course, but we every year had a very big number of visitors coming to the memorial. 2019, or 2.3 million people that came here from really all over the world. And many of them decided to join one of our guided tours to learn more about the place, not just to go through the place to experience it like physically, but also to learn a little bit more. So like 80% of the visitors really decided to have the guided visit. And I think we can reach them with our message. If that is that many people coming, and the message is, as I mentioned before, right, that Auschwitz did not descend from the skies, but also the very important message of the memorial today is that we cannot be indifferent, because also the indifference leads to, of course, in extreme situations, but it also leads to genocides, because also back then in 1930s in the Nazi Germany, there were people who opposed but did not speak up about that, or who were just indifferent, who looked at the mass transports and did nothing. So we strongly believe here in the museum that what is really important nowadays, with similar things happening on different levels across the world, is just to be able to look around us and to ask ourselves the question if the similar things are not happening somewhere around here. And of course, we as normal people probably have no big influence on what the some institutions or governments are doing. But on the other hand, I think there are tools to stop such things. International organizations that at least should be able to react when we see that things are going bad somewhere.
Yeah. It's interesting, yeah, about the museum space, isn't it? In that sense, to in my own research, I was trying to find out what are the major movements that happened between the 1930s till the early 40s, when all of this became really at a level, because as you said, many of these scholarship also kind of says that when a propaganda starts, or in the case of Nazi Germany, when the propaganda started after First World War, nobody would have realized it would get into these kind of situations. It kind of it rolls on as if it is rolling from on a slope, isn't it? And it takes its own momentum, its own forms, and its own outcomes, in ways that many can control eventually in many forms. So I was thinking and trying to find out what are the movements that has resisted it, how has people came together to stop it, and only I could see a few, like the White Rose movement and a few others. But I was thinking, does the museum archive such kinds of movements, such kinds of conversations too?
Well, our archive has mostly the documents that were created in the camp itself.
Correct.
But we know, for example, that among the prisoners,
correct,
there was kind of let's call it the resistance movement.
right.
So there were people who tried to oppose on different levels, the different ways. The question is what we think the resistance is. Because on one hand, it can be, of course, you can get armed and try to fight, but on the other hand, you can just try to save lives. And this is also, in this case, this is also, I think, the resistance. So you know that it also happened that there were prisons helping others.
Correct.
The help was just sometimes very simple. I'll give you the example. When, for example, the Jewish transport arrived, the Jewish transport that was supposed to be killed in the gas chambers. And before they were sent to the gas chambers, there was the so-called selection carried out.
Correct.
Which means that some people were selected as fit for work and some as not.
No. Now, and those who are not straight goes to the chambers in many cases.
They were sent straight to go to the chambers. And now when they got off the train, there were always prisoners working on the platform where they arrived. And these prisoners, for example, they of course did not explain them that this is death camp and that most of them are going to die. But for example, they approached some of them and they told them, tell the Nazi you are not 15, but you are 18, or tell you're younger than you are, or tell them that you have a good occupation.
Correct.
And this is also in a way the resistance, right? They're helping people to survive. Of course, some of them did that, some of them did not because they couldn't understand it. But I think this is also very important.
Absolutely important point, you said. Absolutely important point. And in many ways, if we look at resistance within the structures of the camp itself, like in any other movement, we see lots of it. The rebellion by the Soldier Commandos, so on and so forth. But they had their own deeper limitations. And the point you said about caring and saving was the more enduring resistance inside the camp, really speaking. And it could really, that's a very important point. And I was thinking, if that could be looked outside, if we looked at resistances outside of similar kinds, right, then this would not have happened in that sense. A lot of people, I'm just saying, if you think outside the concentration camps and on an everyday society, we have movements which resisted in terms of, don't do this. But if we had movements which, for instance, had resisted from the beginning itself in not joining the propaganda, in actually enabling care and etc., it would have been a very different outcome, isn't it, in that sense?
I agree.
Yeah. So just on the point on the museum itself, just for a second. So what is the biggest message you said that you want, or you're trying to give through the museum, is that the chimneys or the gas chambers is not where it started. It started much early, and you have to think,
Exactly.
is that, yeah?
Exactly. That's our message. So
Right.
just to make people aware that, again, as you also pointed out, the propaganda leads in extreme situations to genocides, and this is very, very important thing for us.
Great. Very significant point, valued all across the world, particularly in the current condition. And maybe this is my last question, broadly speaking. We are about 20 minutes. As you mentioned also earlier, Auschwitz and Nazi concentration camps happened only 75 to 80 years ago. It's contemporary modern society. The only thing that probably we had after that age is internet, and everything else we enjoy today is exactly from that age, including, even the internet came from the atomic research that happened around that time, isn't it? In that sense. So all the foundations of our modern contemporary society has been there. And so, my father was born around then, in fact, so it is and as we said, there are survivors and from the world, from these concentration camps. So it is not any remote past. It is part of our contemporary history and consciousness. And in fact, it is definitely, when it comes to Europe, it is definitely part of that shaped Europe, as connected to Second World Wars or the two World Wars and all of that. But again, after a small lull, we see again rising trend of racism, religious fundamentalism, violent nationalism, cultural genocides in our current world as we speak. And it's been on the rise in the last few decades. What do you think are the lessons from Auschwitz then for the future of humanity to learn?
First of all, I really like that you use the term lessons from Auschwitz, because I think it's crucial. Many people used to think that it should be a lesson of history, but now it should be the lesson from history, and that's a crucial thing. I think the most important lesson that comes from Auschwitz is that you cannot, we shouldn't perceive people as better or worse than because they have different beliefs, because they are different than the standard that is set by somebody. And unfortunately today across Europe and across the world, it's really happening. People are again judging other people just because they are different than they think they should be. And I think that's the lesson that comes from Auschwitz. If you treat people like this, then it leads to let's say to the gas chambers. But of course, we have to be very, very careful to today not to let these people who think they are better and worse people really to take over our world, because otherwise I think it's very dangerous.
Wow, very well said. In the sense you're saying, we have to assume our responsibility as everyday people to be able to stop the irresponsible people
Exactly.
to lead us into this kind of situation. Because the moment we get into a complex structural condition, then we can't get out of it, right? Like the resistance inside the camp can only go so far.
Right.
But we have to do the stuff before the camp happened, before this happened. And, that is at the point of really challenging the irresponsible, whether they're leaders, politicians, whoever they are, it doesn't matter, right? In that sense. Okay.
Exactly.
Thanks so much, Tomasz.
Thank you.
This has been very informational and educational, and it's been a privilege for us to hear from you, from the museum. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you. It's really my privilege to be able to join you.
Thank you.
You.